For decades, Paul Anka kept one of the most powerful secrets in music history. Words spoken to him in confidence by the one and only Frank Sinatra. Now, after years of silence, Anka is finally breaking his vow and revealing what really happened behind closed doors. The truth about their friendship, their rivalries, and Sinatra's final confession will leave you stunned. What did old Blue Eyes say that Paul Anka swore to keep hidden? Until now, Paul Anka wasn't supposed to become a legend. He was just a kid from Ottawa, Canada. Shy, small, and full of restless energy. While other teenagers were thinking about cars and dates, Paul was thinking about songs. He spent hours in his small room with an old piano, scribbling down lyrics on scraps of paper, dreaming of stages far bigger than anything he had ever seen. His family wasn't rich or connected. His father ran a small restaurant and his mother kept the household running with quiet strength. But Paul had something that couldn't be taught: belief. He truly thought he could make it, even when no one else did. At 15, he wrote a song about a girl who didn't even know he existed. Her name was Diana, and his heart ached for her in that pure teenage way that feels like the end of the world. He turned that feeling into music, writing Diana late at night, his voice cracking but his conviction unshakable. When the song was released, no one expected much. But then, like a spark catching a forest, it spread everywhere. Radio stations couldn't stop playing it. Suddenly, Paul wasn't just a kid from Canada. He was a global star. Imagine being 15 and hearing your voice on every radio, seeing crowds scream your name. Most kids would have lost themselves in it, but Paul didn't. He was smart enough to know that fame fades fast if you don't build something solid underneath. While other teenage stars soaked in the attention, Paul was in studios, watching, learning, asking questions. He wanted to understand how the business worked, not just how to sing, but how to create. By the time he was 18, he had toured the world, met Elvis Presley, and earned respect from people twice his age. But even with all that success, Paul never felt like he fully belonged. He was Canadian in an American industry, young in a world ruled by older men, and emotional in a business built on image. Still, that outsider feeling became his secret weapon. It kept him hungry, focused, and always ready to prove himself. Looking back, Paul often said his biggest strength was that he never stopped dreaming bigger than the world around him. He wasn't born into fame. He built it note by note, word by word, from a tiny room in Ottawa. And that drive, that need to create something lasting, would one day lead him straight into the orbit of the greatest singer of all time, Frank Sinatra. The story of My Way didn't start in a fancy recording studio or a glamorous Hollywood party. It began in a quiet hotel room in New York City, sometime in the late 1960s. Paul Anka sat alone, staring at a blank sheet of paper, a cigarette burning in an ashtray beside him. He'd been thinking about Frank Sinatra, the man everyone called the chairman of the board, the voice of an era. Sinatra was talking about retiring, walking away from the spotlight that had defined his life. And Paul, still young but wise beyond his years, felt that someone needed to write him a goodbye worthy of who he was. Not a love song, not a hit for the charts, but something that sounded like the closing chapter of a life lived on its own terms. Paul had recently heard a French tune called Comme d'habitude. The melody stuck with him, but the lyrics didn't fit. They were about routine, about the boredom of everyday love. Paul didn't want that. He wanted something powerful, something that captured the feeling of looking back without regret. So that night, he sat down and started writing. He imagined Sinatra sitting in a dark room, drink in hand, reflecting on his life, the wins, the losses, the women, the fame. From that image came the words, "And now the end is near, and so I face the final curtain." The lyrics poured out like a confession. It wasn't about arrogance or defiance. It was about pride, the kind that comes from surviving your own story. When Paul finished, he knew he had something special. It wasn't just a song. It was a message. A mirror for anyone who'd ever lived boldly, made mistakes, and refused to apologize for them. When he finally played it for Sinatra, the room fell silent. Frank leaned back, listening, his eyes half closed. When the song ended, there was a long pause. Then he said, "That's me. That's my story." That was all it took. Sinatra recorded My Way in December 1968, and when it hit the airwaves, the world changed. The song became more than music. It became a declaration. When Sinatra sang it, people heard confidence, power, and control. But those who really listened heard something deeper: exhaustion, reflection, and the bittersweet truth of a man who had lived under the weight of his own legend. My Way became the anthem of independence, of living life by your own code, even when it cost you. It was played at weddings, funerals, graduations, and farewells. It became one of the most covered songs in history, from Elvis Presley to Sid Vicious. And at every corner of the world, when people heard it, they thought of Frank Sinatra. But behind that anthem stood Paul Anka, a young songwriter who had captured another man's soul, and in doing so, gave away a part of his own. He didn't fight for ownership. He didn't demand credit. He knew that if he wanted Sinatra to make it eternal, he had to let it go. So he did. For years, Paul watched the song grow without him. He'd see Sinatra perform it on television, in Las Vegas, in front of presidents and kings. The crowd would roar, and Sinatra would nod to the orchestra, taking his time before that final line, "I did it my way." And every time, Paul felt two things at once: pride and distance. Pride because he had written it, distance because the world didn't know. In interviews, Paul always spoke of Sinatra with respect. He never claimed more than he was given. But deep down, he knew My Way was his voice too, his story of ambition, defiance, and survival. Sinatra had lived it, yes, but Paul had written it from the heart of someone who also refused to follow the rules. Decades later, Paul began performing My Way again in his concerts. His version was different, softer, more personal. When he sang the words, "Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention," it didn't sound like a farewell. It sounded like a man at peace. People often ask him if he ever felt angry that Sinatra got all the glory. He always smiles and says, "No, that's how it was supposed to be." But there's a pause before he adds, "I just wanted people to know I was there." The truth is, My Way changed two lives. It became Sinatra's final bow, his musical signature, his last word to the world. But it also defined Paul Anka's legacy in a quieter, more enduring way. It proved that a songwriter could shape history without standing in the spotlight. Paul once said that when he wrote it, he was thinking about how people face the end, not just the end of a career, but the end of everything. "You can't live forever," he said, "but you can make something that does." And My Way did just that. It became immortal. Today, when people hear that opening line, they don't just think of Sinatra. They think of courage, independence, and the kind of pride that only comes from living honestly. They think of the men and women who walked their paths without apology. And somewhere in the echoes of that song, behind Sinatra's smooth voice and the swelling orchestra, is a young man from Ottawa who dreamed bigger than his world and wrote the words that gave a legend his final goodbye. Being around Frank Sinatra was like stepping into another universe, a world where everything sparkled, but not everything was real. Paul Anka was young when he first got close to Sinatra, barely in his 20s, full of excitement and admiration. To him, Frank wasn't just a singer, he was the singer. A man whose voice could stop time and whose name could open any door. But once Paul entered Sinatra's orbit, he quickly learned that fame at that level came with its own rules and its own shadows. The first time he was invited into one of Frank's legendary Las Vegas gatherings, Paul could hardly believe it. The suits were sharp, the whiskey flowed like water, and the laughter never stopped. The Rat Pack, Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and their circle seemed untouchable. They weren't just entertainers, they were kings of a world that ran on charm, loyalty, and unspoken power. When Frank walked into a room, everything shifted. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned. It wasn't forced, it was nature. Sinatra was the center of gravity. From the outside, it all looked glamorous. The limousines, the packed shows, the flashing lights, the women who seemed to appear like magic. But Paul soon saw what outsiders couldn't: the tension under the laughter, the rules no one dared to question. In Frank's world, loyalty was everything, but it wasn't the kind of loyalty you chose, it was expected. If you were in, you stayed in. If you crossed the line, you vanished. People didn't talk about it openly, but everyone felt it. Sinatra didn't need to yell to make a point. A single look from him could change the temperature in the room. When he liked you, life was good. Doors opened. Calls got answered. But if he turned cold, you'd feel it instantly. Paul watched talented people fall out of favor for reasons no one explained. One wrong word, one bad joke, one step too far into Sinatra's spotlight, and that was it. You were done. Paul wasn't part of the Rat Pack officially, but he was close enough to sense the invisible line between belonging and being tolerated. He admired Sinatra deeply. How could he not? Frank had taken My Way, the song Paul had written, and turned it into something eternal. But that admiration came with awareness. Paul knew that in Sinatra's kingdom, everything belonged to Frank, even the people. There were moments that still haunted Paul decades later. One night, after a show in Las Vegas, he went backstage to talk to Frank. He was excited, full of ideas, eager to share new material. But when he walked in, the room fell quiet. Sinatra sat at a table with two men Paul didn't recognize. He didn't smile. He didn't look up right away. Finally he said, "Don't forget who made that song matter, kid." The words hit like ice. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Sinatra didn't just sing My Way, he owned it now, and everyone knew it. Paul understood. That's how the game worked. Sinatra was the king and everyone else was just playing in his court. You didn't argue, you nodded, smiled, and learned when to keep your mouth shut. Still, that moment stayed with him, a sharp lesson in how power moved in silence. The deeper Paul went into that world, the more he realized it wasn't built on glamour alone. There were friends of the family, men who weren't singers or producers, but who always seemed to be around. They didn't say much, but when they did, people listened. Some of them gave advice about gigs or contracts. Others gave warnings that didn't sound like warnings until it was too late. Sinatra didn't order things to happen, they just did. Paul never got involved in anything shady, but he saw enough to know where the boundaries were. You didn't ask too many questions, you didn't refuse invitations, you didn't talk to the wrong people about the wrong things. Everything was about respect, or, more accurately, fear disguised as respect. There was one night in Chicago that Paul would never forget. After one of Sinatra's shows, Paul was invited to a private suite upstairs. The mood was friendly, drinks, small talk, the usual charm. Then things shifted. A piece of paper appeared on the table. It wasn't a contract, just a mutual understanding. It promised opportunity, protection, and family. The message was clear: say yes and everything would be easier. Say no and, well, no one had to explain what might happen next. Paul smiled, said he'd have his lawyer look it over, and left. He never signed. In the weeks that followed, a few of his gigs were mysteriously canceled. Calls stopped coming, and then, just as suddenly, it all went back to normal, like nothing had ever happened. He never mentioned that night to anyone, not because he was scared, but because in that world, silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Years later, when Paul looked back on those times, he didn't speak with anger. He spoke with understanding. Sinatra was complicated. Part genius, part storm. He could be the most generous man in the world one night and impossible the next. He lived on his own terms, just like the song said, and in his orbit, everyone else had to learn to do the same or get burned. Paul survived because he learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. He gave Sinatra his respect, but he also kept his distance. Behind the tuxedos, the applause, and the laughter, he saw what few people ever did, that even legends have shadows. And while Sinatra's world was full of glitter and gold, Paul Anka would later say that not all that glittered was truly golden. For most of his life, Paul Anka was the gentleman of show business, always polished, always composed, always respectful. He had lived through the chaos of fame, the highs of success, and the quiet frustrations of being overshadowed by legends. To the public, he was the man who wrote Diana, the teenage heartthrob who never aged, the songwriter behind Sinatra's My Way. But behind the smile and tuxedo was a man who had carried a lifetime of silence. He had seen things in the industry that few would ever understand, and for decades he kept those memories locked away. Now, in his 80s, he's finally opening up, not out of anger, but out of peace. At 84, Paul Anka moves through life differently. The energy is still there, the sharp wit, the command of the stage, but now it's mixed with something softer: wisdom. He performs not to prove anything, but to connect. When he sings My Way now, it feels less like a song and more like a confession. His voice, older but steady, carries a weight it didn't before. the weight of a man who has seen the full circle of his own creation. The audience stands, singing along, some with tears in their eyes, and Paul simply smiles. He's not thinking about the money or the charts. He's thinking about how far he's come, and how long it took for people to finally see the truth behind the legend. For decades, he had watched My Way belong to Sinatra. He never complained. He understood the unwritten rule of the old world. Respect the hierarchy, never challenge the king. Sinatra was the son, and everyone else revolved around him. Paul accepted that because he knew the song would live longer than both of them. But time has a way of balancing stories. As the years passed, as Sinatra's era faded into nostalgia, people began asking questions. Who wrote it? Where did it come from? And slowly Paul's name began to return to the spotlight, this time not as a teen idol, but as the master behind one of the greatest songs ever written. He started to talk more freely about those years, about Sinatra, about the unspoken pressure, about the strange mix of glamour and danger that came with being part of that world. He didn't expose or accuse anyone. That wasn't his style. Instead, he spoke like a man remembering both the beauty and the cost of his journey. Frank was complicated, he said once in an interview. He could be kind, funny, and incredibly generous. But he could also be difficult, demanding. You had to know when to speak and when to stay quiet. That's how you survive. The way Paul tells it, his silence wasn't out of fear, it was out of respect. He knew that legends are fragile things, built as much on mystery as on truth. But now, he isn't afraid to share the details. He talks about the night in Chicago when a few friends of the family offered him a deal that felt more like a trap. He remembers the paper, the careful words, the unspoken warning. And he remembers saying no. It was one of the hardest things he ever did, not because he was scared, but because he understood what it meant. Saying no in Sinatra's world wasn't defiance, it was survival. That night changed him. It made him realize that his path would always be different. He didn't want to live under someone else's shadow, no matter how bright that shadow was. He wanted to build something of his own, even if it took a lifetime to be recognized for it. And in a way, that's exactly what he did. In the years that followed, Paul built a career few could match. He wrote songs for everyone: Tom Jones, Buddy Holly, Michael Jackson. His fingerprints are everywhere in pop music, from the swinging hits of the 60s to the timeless ballads of the 80s. He didn't shout for credit, he just kept working. His approach was simple: keep creating, stay true, and let the music speak. And over time, it did. Now, looking back, Paul talks about My Way with both pride and tenderness. He says the song isn't just about Sinatra. It's about every person who's ever faced the end of something and stood tall. It's about the courage to make mistakes and own them, the strength to live life without apology. When he performs it today, he often pauses before the last verse, letting the silence fill the room. You can almost feel him thinking about all the people who sang it before him: Sinatra, Elvis, countless others, and how the song became a part of so many lives. Then he smiles, nods, and sings the line that has defined him more than any other: I did it my way. In interviews, he's honest but never bitter. He says the music business has changed. Too fast, too shallow, too disposable. But he also admits he's grateful he lived through the golden years, when songs had to mean something. Back then, he says, if you didn't bleed for it, it didn't last. He still believes that. Maybe that's why his music still feels alive. It came from a place of truth, from a man who refused to play by anyone else's rule. Away from the stage, Paul lives quietly. He splits his time between California and Las Vegas, surrounded by family, music, and the kind of peace he spent decades chasing. He's not chasing trends or headlines anymore. He doesn't need to. He's already written his legacy. Younger artists still call him for advice, and he tells them the same thing every time: be yourself, but be smart. The world will try to change you. Don't let it. Sometimes, when he's alone, he listens to old recordings: Sinatra singing My Way, the crackle of vinyl, the orchestra swelling, and he smiles. He says it still feels surreal that something he wrote in one night could become immortal. He's long past needing credit or applause. What matters to him now is truth. The truth of how the song was born, the truth of what he lived through, and the truth that even in the shadows of giants, he managed to keep his soul intact. Paul Anka is proof that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right moment to speak. And now, in the twilight of his life, he finally is. Not with anger, but with honesty. Not to rewrite history, but to complete it. because for too long people saw him as the man who gave Sinatra his song. But the truth is simpler. He gave the world one of the greatest songs ever written, and in doing so, he wrote his own story of courage, endurance, and quiet victory. When you see Paul on stage today, smiling under the lights, singing those words one more time, you can feel it. He's not just performing a song. He's telling his story. A story of a boy from Ottawa who dreamed big, faced giants, kept his dignity, and, in the end, lived exactly the way he wrote it. His way.